My name is Margaret Elaine Townsend, and I am 82 years old. I've lived a quiet life in a small house nestled in the outskirts of Boston. I spend most of my days tending to my garden, feeding the stray cats that seem to think I'm their grandmother, and writing in my old, worn-out journal that's as weathered as I am. But last week something happened that shook my very soul. It all started when I received a letter. An old, yellowed envelope with no return address. Inside was a photograph, faded and cracked with time. It was a picture of me at 17, wearing the postulant's white habit, standing beside a priest with his hand gently placed on my shoulder. Father Brennan. There was no note, just that photo. But I knew what it meant. My fingers trembled as I turned it over. On the back, in delicate cursive, were 4 haunting words. He kept the others. I felt the breath leave my body. It had been 65 years since I last saw Father Brennan. And 45 since I gave up on the idea that I'd ever find peace about what happened to me in that convent. Now, everything was coming back, and something darker was chasing it. That very night, I dug into the wooden chest at the foot of my bed where I kept all things I didn't want to remember. My diary from the convent days was still there, wrapped in a piece of my old postulant veil. I hadn't opened it in over 4 decades. But as soon as I did, I remembered the whispers. The missing girl. And the day Father Brennan told me I wasn't holy enough to become a nun. I believed him. For years I believed I had failed. That I was never good enough for the church. But now I'm not so sure he turned me away for my sake. Because that same night I had a dream. A voice, soft, distant, unmistakable, whispered a name I hadn't heard in decades. Sister Anne-Marie. I sat up in bed, drenched in sweat. She disappeared the week before my rejection. No one ever spoke of her again. No goodbye. No funeral. Nothing. And I never questioned it, because Father Brennan told us she had returned to her family. But what if she didn't? What if she never left? And what if I had been next? The next morning, I called the convent where I had once lived. It had changed names, and the sisters I knew were long gone. But the building remained. They told me they'd just begun restoring the West Wing, the wing that had been closed since 1978, the year I left. The voice on the other end said something odd before hanging up. The walls talk, Mrs. Townsend. Sometimes they scream. I booked a bus ticket the very next day. But what I found there, let's just say I wish I'd never gone back. To be continued in Chapter 2. Backhand index pointing right if you're drawn in already. Don't forget to like, comment your thoughts below, and subscribe for the next chilling chapter. You won't believe what Grandma Margaret uncovers next. You said. Continue. ChatGPT said. Chapter 2. The ride to St. Weller's Convent took 4 hours. I hadn't made that journey in over 40 years, yet as we passed through the winding hills and misty fields of my youth, the ghosts of that place stirred like fog clinging to the glass. I kept my eyes fixed on the horizon, gripping that old photograph in my hand like a lifeline. When I arrived, the sun was beginning to dip behind the chapel spire. The convent grounds looked eerily similar, except older, sadder, as though time had soaked the bricks in silence and regret. The iron gates were half open. No one was around. Just wind, and the sound of gravel crunching beneath my cane. I hesitated before walking in. The last time I'd stood on those steps, I'd been 17, heartbroken and ashamed, watching the other girls begin their journey as brides of Christ while I was told to pack my things. I remember Father Brennan's words like they were branded into my spine. You lack purity, Margaret. You will never find God here. But as I stood before those doors again, I wasn't that girl anymore. I was a woman with questions, and I wasn't leaving without answers. A young nun opened the door, startled at first. Can I help you? She asked. I used to live here, I replied. Back when it was still St. Weller's. I'd like to see the West Wing. Her face changed, like I'd mentioned a curse. Oh, that area's not open yet. Renovation. I won't be long, I said firmly. She stared at me a moment before stepping aside. Stay to the right. And, If you hear anything strange, just ignore it. Old walls, you know. But I knew better. I stepped into the main hall, the scent of candle wax and old wood flooding my senses. Every inch of me trembled as I passed the prayer room. The statue of St. Catherine still cracked at the base from the day Sister Anne-Marie fell into it. No was pushed into it. No one had ever spoken of that moment. We were told she fainted, that she left the next day. But I remembered her eyes before she fell. Wait, terrified. Focused on someone standing behind me. I followed the narrow corridor toward the west wing, my cane tapping softly on the worn floorboards. The hallway was colder here. Mused. One door was open. And that's when I saw it. Inside the room was a small pile of rubble from broken ceiling plaster. But behind it, in the far corner, something was half buried. Habit. Like the ones we wore as postulants. And beneath it bones. I gasped and stumbled back, hitting the wall behind me. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely breathe. They weren't hidden well. Just enough to be forgotten. Someone had tried to bury her here. Whoever wore that habit never made it out. My knees nearly gave way. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the old photograph. Compared the veil. The same stitching. My fingers trembled. Was that Sister Anne-Marie? Just then I heard footsteps behind me. Heavy. Low. Deliberate. I turned, bracing for the worst. But it wasn't a nun. It was an old man in a gray priest's collar. His thin frame hunched, but unmistakable. Father Brennan. Still alive. And he was staring at the bones with no surprise in his eyes. Only regret. They told me you were dead, I whispered. He smiled. I am Margaret. In all the ways that count. I opened my mouth to speak, but he raised a trembling hand. Don't say her name, he said, his voice hollow. It's better if you don't remember what happened that night. But I did remember. And I wanted him to say it. To confess. But what he said next. It wasn't a confession. It was a threat. If you keep digging, Margaret, someone else might end up in these walls. Froze. So he wasn't afraid of justice. He was afraid of exposure. And someone, maybe not him, was still protecting this secret. But who? And why, after all these years, was I being warned to forget? Because I wasn't the only one still alive from back then. And not all of us left willingly. If this chapter gave you chills, don't go yet. Like, comment what you think happened to Sister Anne-Marie. And subscribe so you don't miss next chapter. The truth is just beginning to rise from the shadows. The ride to St. Weller's Convent took 4 hours. I hadn't made that journey in over 40 years, yet as we passed through the winding hills and misty fields of my youth, the ghosts of that place stirred like fog clinging to the glass. I kept my eyes fixed on the horizon, gripping that old photograph in my hand like a lifeline. When I arrived, the sun was beginning to dip behind the chapel spire. The convent grounds looked eerily similar, except older, sadder, as though time had soaked the bricks in silence and regret. The iron gates were half open. No one was around. Just wind, and the sound of gravel crunching beneath my cane. I hesitated before walking in. The last time I'd stood on those steps, I'd been 17, heartbroken and ashamed, watching the other girls begin their journey as brides of Christ while I was told to pack my things. I remember Father Brennan's words like they were branded into my spine. You lack purity, Margaret. You will never find God here. But as I stood before those doors again, I wasn't that girl anymore. I was a woman with questions. And I wasn't leaving without answers. A young nun opened the door, startled at first. Can I help you? She asked. I used to live here, I replied. Back when it was still St. Weller's. I'd like to see the West Wing. Her face changed, like I'd mentioned a curse. Oh, that area's not open yet. Renovation. I won't be long, I said firmly. She stared at me a moment before stepping aside. Stay to the right. And, if you hear anything strange, just ignore it. Old walls, you know. But I knew better. I stepped into the main hall, the scent of candle wax and old wood flooding my senses. Every inch of me trembled as I passed the prayer room, The statue of St. Catherine still cracked at the base from the day Sister Anne-Marie fell into it. No was pushed into it. No one had ever spoken of that moment. We were told she fainted, that she left the next day. But I remembered her eyes before she fell. Wait, terrified. Focused on someone standing behind me. I followed the narrow corridor toward the west wing, my cane tapping softly on the worn floorboards. The hallway was colder here. Mused. One door was open. And that's when I saw it. Inside the room was a small pile of rubble from broken ceiling plaster. But behind it, in the far corner, something was half buried. Habit. Like the ones we wore as postulants. And beneath it bones. I gasped and stumbled back, hitting the wall behind me. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely breathe. They weren't hidden well. Just enough to be forgotten. Someone had tried to bury her here. Whoever wore that habit never made it out. My knees nearly gave way. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the old photograph. Compared the veil. The same stitching. My fingers trembled. Was that Sister Anne-Marie? Just then I heard footsteps behind me. Heavy. Low. Deliberate. I turned, bracing for the worst. But it wasn't a nun. It was an old man in a gray priest's collar. His thin frame hunched, but unmistakable. Father Brennan. Still alive. And he was staring at the bones with no surprise in his eyes. Only regret. They told me you were dead, I whispered. He smiled. I am Margaret. In all the ways that count. I opened my mouth to speak, but he raised a trembling hand. Don't say her name, he said, his voice hollow. It's better if you don't remember what happened that night. But I did remember. And I wanted him to say it. To confess. But what he said next. It wasn't a confession. It was a threat. If you keep digging, Margaret, someone else might end up in these walls. Froze. So he wasn't afraid of justice. He was afraid of exposure. And someone, maybe not him, was still protecting this secret. But who? And why, after all these years, was I being warned to forget? Because I wasn't the only one still alive from back then. And not all of us left willingly. To be continued in Chapter 3. If this chapter gave you chills, don't go yet. Like, comment what you think happened to Sister Anne-Marie. And subscribe so you don't miss next chapter. The truth is just beginning to rise from the shadows. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed in a small inn 2 miles from the convent. The walls were thin and the heater groaned like it was trying to breathe, but it wasn't the cold that kept me up. It was his eyes. Father Brennan's eyes. They didn't hold remorse. They held warnings. Shadows of something deeper than sin. And those bones. I stared at the ceiling, hand on my chest, trying to steady my breath. I wasn't just uncovering a mystery. I was walking straight into a graveyard disguised as a house of God. At dawn I returned to the convent, but the doors were locked. A handwritten sign read, "Closed to the public due to private mass." My gut told me it was more than that. I walked around to the side path that led to the west garden, the old trail where the postulants used to tend to the herbs and roses. The wall had a break in it, one I remembered using as a shortcut to escape evening vespers when I was a girl. I slipped through it with more difficulty now but made it in. Inside the garden, overgrown and mostly forgotten, I spotted the chapel window that faced the west wing. And inside I saw her. Sister Margareton. She had been one of the young novices when I arrived at the convent in the 70s. Quiet. Always observing. She was still here. After all these years. She was standing near the same corridor where I'd seen the bones. Alone. Holding what looked like a small lantern or candle holder. Her face was aged but solemn, carved by years of silence. I knocked gently on the window. She looked up, and when she saw me, her eyes widened. Not with fear but recognition. She opened the window slowly and whispered, "You shouldn't be here. Why didn't you say anything?" Yes. She looked over her shoulder nervously. Because what happened? It wasn't just Father Brennan. It never was. I felt a cold breath curl up my spine. She leaned closer. He wasn't the only one using the convent as a hiding place for sins. They all knew. They covered for each other. I stared at her, my mouth dry. Who is they? But she shut the window without another word, disappearing into the hallway. My hands shook. A picture. The bones. The whisper in the night. It was unraveling too fast, and I was alone in it. But I had one ally left. My old friend from those years, Ruth Miller. She'd left the convent 2 months before I was dismissed and went on to marry and have a family in Connecticut. We hadn't spoken in 20 years, but if anyone remembered what I did, it would be her. I caught the next bus to New Haven. When I reached Ruth's house, a young woman answered the door. Her eyes were red. She looked exhausted. "Are you here for my mother?" she asked. He nodded. She hesitated. "She passed away 2 days ago." Throat. Sudden. I felt like the air had been punched out of me. "Did she mention me?" "Margaret Townsend." The young woman blinked. "Actually, yes. Yesterday morning when we were going through her things, she told me, barely a whisper, to give you something. Said you'd come." She led me inside and returned with a small metal tin. Inside was a sealed envelope addressed to me, and a tiny cloth pouch. My hands trembled as I opened the letter. "Margaret, if you're reading this, then you came looking. I'm sorry I couldn't be there to help you. But I remembered something I never told anyone, not even my husband. The night Anne-Marie disappeared, I saw her in the chapel, bleeding, crying. She told me. They took pictures. They said if I told, they'd say I tempted them. I ran to get help. When I came back, she was gone. I kept this hidden for decades. Forgive me, Ruth." I opened the cloth pouch. Inside was a rosary. But not just any rosary, Anne-Marie's. I recognized it instantly. The cross had a crack down the middle, one she said came from her mother dropping it as a child. And wrapped tightly around the beads was a photograph, folded small, old and brittle. I carefully opened it. And there they were, 3 priests, young, laughing, standing beside a girl in white. Marie. But it wasn't a celebration. The way they gripped her arms, the way her face looked frozen in dread, it wasn't right. And one of the priests gasped. It wasn't Father Brennan. It was Bishop Callahan, still active in the diocese, still hailed as a shepherd of the people. That's why they never told the truth. This wasn't about one man's sin. It was an entire chain of evil, rooted deep in the very institution I'd trusted with my soul. And now I held proof. But as I stared at the photo, I noticed something. In the corner of the picture, barely visible, was me. In the background, walking into the frame. I was there that night, and I had no memory of it. Why? What else had I forgotten? Because if they could bury Anne-Marie, they could bury the truth about me too. If this story has your heart racing like mine, don't leave just yet. Like, share your theories in the comments and subscribe now. The darkest part of Margaret's past is only just beginning to surface. You won't believe what's revealed in the next chapter. I sat in Ruth's living room for hours, unable to move. The photograph trembled in my hands as I studied every inch of it. My face in the background, young, unaware, blurred by motion, but undeniably me. I was there that night, present, breathing, alive in that moment when something terrible happened to Anne-Marie. But why didn't I remember? I pressed my palm to my forehead, trying to dig through the haze of memories. I remembered praying with her that evening. I remembered her smile, forced and distant. I remembered her saying, "If anything happens, don't believe what they tell you." Then blank. Was it fear that erased it from my memory? Or something worse? I tucked the photo into my coat and looked up at the ceiling, whispering, "Help me, Lord. Please help me remember." Back at the inn, I laid the photograph, Ruth's letter, and Anne-Marie's rosary out on the bed like puzzle pieces. I needed answers. But not just from memories or whispers. I needed someone who had been there, who had seen what happened behind the scenes. And then I remembered someone I never thought I'd want to see again. Brother Charles. He had been the groundskeeper at St. Weller's. A quiet, gentle man who rarely spoke to the girls. But he had access to everything. Keys, tools, corridors no one else walked. The priests trusted him, but we all knew he had eyes in every room. He saw everything. The next day, I returned to the convent. The young nun at the front desk recognized me instantly and frowned. "Mrs. Townsend, we didn't expect you to come back again. I'm here to see Brother Charles." She hesitated. "He doesn't take visitors. Tell him I still remember the West Garden." And Anne-Marie's scream. That changed her. 10 minutes later, I was led down a narrow hallway to the old infirmary, now a quiet residence for retired clergy. Brother Charles looked older than I expected. Bent, his hands covered in age spots, a tube feeding oxygen into his nose. But when he saw me, his eyes sharpened. "You've come back," he rasped. "I need to know the truth," I said, sitting beside his chair. "You were there the night she disappeared." He turned his face away, coughing violently. "I buried too much," he said finally. "Too much blood. Too much shame." I placed the photograph on his lap. "Tell me who took this." His fingers trembled as he lifted it. This was taken by Father Lorne. He was the one who kept records. Pictures. Everything. Where is he now? Charles's eyes filled with tears. Dead. Died in a fire in '86. But he kept boxes. Notes from confessions. Secrets of priests. He hid them in the old crypt under the chapel. The crypt. The place no one had spoken of for decades. It had been sealed after an electrical fire. Rumors spread that it was haunted, cursed. That's why Anne-Marie was never found. That's why I was sent away. They had to silence anyone who might ask questions. Why did Brennan stop me from taking my vows? Yes. Charles stared at me, his expression tightening. "Because you were asking too many questions. And because you saw that night. They drugged you, Margaret. Just enough to make you forget. But not enough to kill you. Brennan argued to keep you quiet. Said you were a danger." My blood ran cold. "And Anne-Marie." He closed his eyes. "She found Lorne's box. She threatened to tell the bishop. They couldn't let her. So they took her to the crypt. Said she'd be cleansed. That's what they called it. Cleansing." I covered my mouth, my eyes brimming with tears. My entire life, I had believed I wasn't holy enough. That I failed. But the failure was never mine. "Do the boxes still exist?" Charles nodded faintly. "Find the silver cross etched into the third panel behind the altar. Opens. The crypt's still there. Just buried beneath lies." I stood, my legs trembling with new purpose. If those records existed, I could expose them all. Not just for Anne-Marie. Not just for myself. But for every girl they buried in silence. I returned to the convent under the guise of prayer. I waited until dusk, when the halls were quiet and shadows stretched long across the floor. I slipped into the chapel, stood before the altar, and ran my fingers along the wood. Faint but real. A silver cross worn thin by time. Pressed it. Click. The panel creaked open, revealing a dark, narrow staircase descending into stone. I hesitated. The air that escaped was cold, like the exhale of something long dead. I lit the small candle from my pocket and stepped down slowly. Each stair echoed. Each breath felt like a scream in my chest. And at the bottom there it was. A rusted cabinet. But beside it a crowbar. I pried it open with everything I had. Inside dozens of boxes. Files. Photos. Handwritten notes on girls' behaviors, confessions, punishments. And at the top, a file labeled Margaret E. Townsend. I opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a type sheet. Subject drugged after accidental witnessing of cleansing ritual. Memory suppression successful. Removed from postulancy due to risk of exposure. They knew. All this time they knew. But before I could scream, I heard something. A step. Coming down the stairs. Someone else knew I was there. If your heart is racing like mine, don't scroll past. Tap that like button. Leave a comment if you think Margaret will survive what's coming next, and make sure you subscribe. The truth is out, but someone still wants to keep it buried. The footsteps echoed down the stone steps, slow and deliberate, like they weren't in any hurry. Whoever was coming. They already knew I was down there. They weren't chasing me. They were hunting me. I backed away from the cabinet, clutching my file, and flattened myself against the cold crypt wall. My candle flickered violently, shadows crawling up the damp stones like they were alive. I held my breath. And then, I saw him. Not Father Brennan. Bishop Callahan. Alive. A little older, yes, but still upright. Still smug. Still dressed in his priestly black. His gold cross gleaming like a blade in the candlelight. "So," he said, voice smooth and familiar. "You finally found it." I didn't respond. I just stared. "You always were too curious, Margaret," he said, stepping toward the file cabinet. "That's what we admired about you. Until it became a problem." My fingers gripped the folder tighter. "You drugged me," I said. "You covered up her death." He tilted his head, almost amused. "We protected the church. You murdered her." "No," he pointed toward the boxes. "Sin did. The system. The silence that kept everything running smoothly. You're evil." He smiled again. "I'm practical." I looked past him at the staircase behind. My only way out. My legs were trembling, but rage had replaced fear now. "You destroyed girls." He nodded, no shame in his eyes. It's easier to silence one girl than explain how a bishop ends up in a scandal. And now you, Margaret. Now you've made yourself a problem again. He pulled something from his coat pocket, a vial. Clear liquid. Something sharp and deadly. "I'm old," he said, sighing. "Tired. But I won't let you ruin everything in my last days." My heart hammered in my chest. Had to think fast. Then I remembered what Charles told me. They kept records. Even audio. Beside the cabinet was an old reel recorder. I had already flipped the switch without thinking when I opened the cabinet. It had been running this whole time. His voice, his confession was on tape. And I needed to survive long enough to share it. He stepped toward me. I grabbed a candle holder from the floor and swung wildly. It hit his shoulder. He staggered back, cursing. Ran. Up the stairs, my cane abandoned. My knees screamed in protest, but I didn't stop. I burst through the panel behind the altar just as one of the young nuns entered the chapel with a tray of communion cups. She gasped at the sight of me. "Call 911, I shouted. "There's a man in the crypt." But before she could move, Bishop Callahan lunged from the stairs behind me. His face twisted with fury. He shoved past her, running the opposite direction, disappearing down the cloister hallway. I dropped to my knees, sobbing, the folder clutched to my chest. When the police arrived, they sealed the crypt. Took the files. The recordings. Photos. Every last artifact of the hidden sins beneath the church. And me. I was taken to the hospital. Exhaustion, they said. Possible heart strain. I didn't care. I was alive. I stared at the ceiling tiles for hours that night, wondering how close I had come to joining Anne-Marie. Then, just before midnight, a detective came into the room. He sat beside me. "We found a match." He opened a folder. Inside, a photograph of the bones from the West Wing. And dental records. It was her. Anne-Marie's remains. He looked at me with sympathy. "You were right, Mrs. Townsend. They lied. For years. But not anymore." I nodded, barely able to speak. He stood to leave but turned back. "One more thing. We found something unusual. In your file, the one marked with your name. There's a note in Father Lorne's handwriting. It said, 'Keep her alive. She may be our last witness. Or our last threat.'" My mouth went dry. "So they spared me just in case?" The detective didn't answer. And maybe he didn't have to. But there was still one piece I hadn't told him. That photograph from Ruth's pouch. It had something scribbled on the back in faint pencil. There are more. And one of them still wears the cloth. I lay there in that hospital bed, a chill creeping into my bones. Because the bishop wasn't acting alone. And someone else was still hiding in plain sight. Don't stop now. Tap like, leave a comment if you're still with Grandma Margaret in this journey, and hit that subscribe button. The truth has only begun to surface. And someone's still trying to bury it again. I was discharged from the hospital the next afternoon, but nothing felt like recovery. My body may have been stitched and bandaged, but my soul had been torn wide open. The truth was out. Anne-Marie had been murdered, the church had buried it, and Bishop Callahan had nearly done the same to me. But it wasn't over. Not even close. The scribbled note on the back of the photo. There are more. And one of them still wears the cloth, kept looping through my mind like a prayer turned curse. Someone else had been involved. Someone still inside. Still active. And if they knew I had that photo, they might already be watching me. I stayed in a small motel under a different name. Margaret Elder. I didn't want to go back to my house in Boston. Not yet. Too exposed. Too easy to find. That night, I received a call from the young nun at the convent, the one who had let me in, who saw Callahan chase me from the crypt. Her name was Sister Ruth Marie. I believe you, she whispered. They've started telling us that none of it happened. That you were confused. That Bishop Callahan is on retreat. Retreat? I asked, sitting up. He tried to kill me. I know. That's why I'm calling. Pause. There's a priest. Father Andrew Lowell. He's new to our diocese. Transferred 2 years ago. I overheard him talking in the hallway this morning, he said. We should have dealt with her like we did the others. My skin went cold. Are you sure? Yes. He mentioned a place. A retreat center. St. Armand's. In the woods outside Providence. That's where they send the ones they need to retrain. Retrain. A euphemism. Another layer of lies. I'll go, I said, surprising myself. Don't, she warned. If they see you. I'm not afraid anymore. But that was a lie. I was terrified. Still, I rented a car the next morning and drove to the address she gave me. A gated property surrounded by thick woods and tall iron fences. The sign read St. Armand's Renewal Center. From the outside it looked serene. Holy. I've parked across the road watching. At 3:17 p.m., a black car pulled up to the gate. Out stepped a man in a white clerical collar and long gray coat. He turned and I saw him. Father Brennan. He wasn't retired. He wasn't ill. He was running the place. I watched in silence as he unlocked the gate, greeted another man in plain clothes, and walked inside. I couldn't breathe. The man who told me I was unworthy, who drugged me, who silenced Anne-Marie, was running a rehabilitation center for priests. What was he doing to the vulnerable girls who came through here? I had to get inside. That night I returned, this time through the backwoods where the fence was lowest. I tore my coat, scraped my palms, but I made it over. I crouched in the brush, heart thudding in my throat. The building was quiet. Lights in only a few rooms. I crept along the side, searching for a way in. And then I saw it. File room. I slipped inside through a propped-open side door, praying no one saw me. The records were alphabetized. Neat. Clean. Annotated. But tucked in a drawer labeled Disciplinary Cases. I found it. Anne-Marie Leclerc. But the file had been altered. The date of death. Not applicable. Status. Transferred. Transferred. My hand shook. Then I saw the second sheet. Marked confidential. Subject declared unstable. Intervention approved. Medical transfer authorized by Father B. Father Brennan. And beneath that, another name. Supervisor. Father A. Lowell. Father Andrew Lowell. The man Ruth Marie warned me about. He had been involved. And the worst part. There was a current case file beneath it. One dated just 2 weeks ago. Subject. Ruth Marie Gonzalez. Notes scribbled. Disobedient. Inquisitive. Intervention scheduled. My vision blurred. They were planning to silence her, just like they did to Anne-Marie, just like they tried to do to me. I shoved the file into my coat and turned to leave. But the office door opened. Father Brennan stood there. He looked tired. "Ill. Come. I told you before, Margaret. You should have stayed gone." I reached into my coat, not for a weapon, but for the small recorder I had been using since I left the hospital. "I've got everything," I said. "Everything you've done. Every name. Every file. I'll take it to the press. I'll take it to the Vatican if I have to." But he didn't flinch. He stepped toward me slowly and whispered, "We're not afraid of press. We own the press. And the church. The church protects itself." I stepped back. "You can kill me," I said. "But someone will find out. Someone always does." He stared at me a long moment. Then, to my surprise, he laughed. "Oh, Margaret," he said. "You still think this is about you. But you were never the important one." He turned and walked away. And for the first time I realized something that chilled me deeper than anything else. Maybe I wasn't the target now. Maybe it was Ruth Marie. Are you still with Margaret? Hit the like button, leave a comment if you're ready for her to expose the rest, and make sure to subscribe. What she's about to uncover next could shake everything. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I couldn't, but because I wouldn't. If I closed my eyes, I might never open them again. And worse, Ruth Marie might not make it to morning. She was the only person in that convent willing to help me. And now she was marked. I sat at the edge of the motel bed, Anne-Marie's file on my lap, the new one, Ruth Marie's, clutched to my chest. They were going to intervene. That word had become their ritualistic mask for something much darker. I had less than 12 hours. So I did what I hadn't done in decades. Called a reporter. Not just any reporter. Daniel Cooper, a man I knew through my late husband. He was an investigative journalist for a local paper in Boston, one of the few who still believed in telling the truth, no matter who it hurt. He answered groggy, but his tone sharpened as soon as I said, "I have documents proving a bishop helped cover up the murder of a postulant girl at St. Weller's Convent in 1978. And they're planning to do it again." "Who is this?" "Margaret Townsend." He was silent for a long second. Then, "Where can we meet?" We agreed on a diner 2 towns over. I brought the files, the photo, the audio recording of Bishop Callahan's threat, and Father Brennan's confession from the crypt. He read in silence. His face changed with each page. First confusion, then horror, then cold determination. "This is enough to open a federal investigation," he whispered. "Why hasn't anyone done anything?" "Because they bury the evidence. Just like they buried Anne-Marie." He looked at me like I had just handed him the key to a locked dungeon. "We need to act fast. Do you trust me?" "I don't have time to trust anyone," I said. "I just need you to save her." That night, I returned to the convent. But not alone. Daniel was parked a block away, camera in hand, with backup waiting. He'd tipped off an old friend at the Department of Justice who owed him a favor. If we got footage, anything real, agents would move. I slipped into the side garden the same way I had years ago. The convent was dimly lit, the moon full and heavy, casting long shadows through the arches. I prayed Ruth Marie hadn't already been moved. I crept into the corridor that led to the dormitory and paused by her door. It was slightly open. Inside the lights were off. But I saw her, sitting on her bed, pale, clutching a rosary like it was her last breath. She turned as I entered. Her eyes filled with relief, then fear. "They moved my things," she whispered. "Said I was being reassigned. But they took my phone. I haven't been able to warn anyone. They're planning an intervention. Tonight." She nodded slowly. "I know." I reached into my coat, handed her the file with her name on it. Everything they planned. And everything they did to Anne-Marie. "It's all in here." She stared down at it, tears silently slipping down her cheeks. "I'm going to expose them," I said. "But I need you to leave. Right now." Daniel's waiting at the road. He'll protect you. She nodded, then hesitated. There's something else. What? There's a basement beneath the chapel. I heard Father Lowell say they've already moved the next girl down there. A new postulant. Just 17. She doesn't know what's happening. My heart stopped. They were doing it again. We didn't have time to call anyone else. I followed Ruth Marie down the corridor toward the chapel. Every footstep felt like thunder. Every breath was a silent scream. She stopped beside the altar. There's a trapdoor, she whispered. Beneath the choir rug. We peeled it back. There it was. Wooden. Locked with a rusted latch. I kicked it open with my foot. The stairs beneath led to a stone cellar. Dark, damp, and filled with a scent of mildew and something more acidic. I took one step down, then another. And then I heard it. A whimper. Soft cry. We followed the sound until we found her. A young girl tied to a chair in the corner, gagged with cloth, eyes wide in terror. Her habit was torn. Her lip bleeding. Ruth Marie rushed to her, pulled the gag out, whispered soothing words. That's when we heard footsteps again. But this time they weren't slow. They were coming fast. Angry. Echoing down the stone stairs like the sound of war drums. I stepped in front of the girl, shielding her. Father Lowell appeared. Face red. Breathing heavy. Holding a cloth soaked in clear liquid. Get away from her, he growled. No, I said. He raised the cloth higher, eyes darting between me and Ruth Marie. She asked for this, he said. She was willing. Until she changed her mind. No girl asks for this, I said, voice trembling but firm. He lunged. But Ruth Marie moved faster. She grabbed the iron candlestick holder from the ground and swung with everything in her. It crashed into Lowell's temple. He crumpled, bleeding, moaning. Not dead, but broken. Daniel and 2 agents rushed down the stairs seconds later. The trapdoor left open had been their signal. Flashlights, guns, yelling, restraints. It was over. For the first time, it was over. The girl was rushed to safety. Ruth Marie was placed under protection. The files and tapes were turned over to the Department of Justice. By dawn, St. Weller's Convent was surrounded by federal vehicles. And Father Brennan. He was nowhere to be found. Gone again. But not forgotten. 'Cause this time I had everything. And the world was watching. Don't stop now, like this story if you believe justice should never sleep. Leave a comment for Grandma Margaret and the girls she fought to protect. And subscribe because in the final chapter, the world hears her voice. And the past finally faces its reckoning. I never thought I'd see the day. Federal agents. Media trucks. Drones flying over the sacred walls of St. Weller's Convent. The same place where I once stood in silence, rejected by the church I loved, was now the stage for a reckoning 50 years overdue. I watched it all unfold from the back seat of an unmarked sedan parked across the street. Daniel sat beside me, furiously typing notes on his laptop while the young girl we rescued, her name was Angela, slept under a thermal blanket in the care of a female officer just ahead of us. And yet, I didn't feel relief. Not yet. Because Father Brennan was still missing. And until he was found, justice still had a hole in its heart. An agent stepped up to the window of the car. Mrs. Townsend, we've recovered more files from the crypt. You were right. There's evidence going back to 1962. Victims, payments, transfers, cover-ups. You've exposed something massive. I nodded silently. Have you found Brennan? He shook his head. Interpol's been notified. If he tries to leave the country, we'll know. We have witnesses. He won't escape this. But I had my doubts. Because men like Brennan, they don't run when they're afraid. They hide until the world forgets again. Daniel leaned forward. Margaret, this story's going everywhere. I just got confirmation that the New York Times, BBC, and Le Monde want your side directly. They're calling you the brave grandmother who cracked the church's silence. I stared through the windshield at the convent. I didn't want fame. I wanted the truth. And now the truth is out. That afternoon we held a press conference. The room was packed, reporters, cameras, advocates, survivors. I stood at the podium in my old gray coat, a microphone quivering under my fingers. I was 17 when they told me I wasn't pure enough for the church, I began. And for decades I believed them. I walked away thinking I had failed God, when in reality, it was men who failed us all. Flashbulbs went off. Pens scribbled. Tears fell. In 1978, a girl named Anne-Marie Leclerc was murdered. They said she left. They said she sinned. But she was innocent. And they killed her to protect a lie. I lifted the photo. The one of her. The one with the priests. They drugged me. Made me forget. Until now. I held up the recorder. This is Bishop Callahan admitting his role in the cover-up. And this, I waved the file, is a record of Father Brennan authorizing the silencing of another girl just days ago. Murmurs. Someone cursed under their breath. I'm not here for revenge, I said. I'm here because the truth never rots, even when buried. Applause followed. Then questions. But I didn't answer most of them. Because at that moment my phone buzzed. Unknown number. One text. You still talk too much, Margaret. Some graves should stay sealed. Froze. It wasn't over. That night, I was escorted to a safe house under federal protection. Ruth Marie stayed nearby. Angela, thankfully, was returned to her parents, though her eyes still flickered with quiet trauma. She would need time. Years maybe. But she had a chance. Unlike Anne-Marie. I sat alone in the safe house's guest bedroom, the moonlight seeping through the curtains. I pulled out my journal, the one I kept hidden all these years. My handwriting was shaky now, but my words were steady. They took my youth. They nearly took my life. But they didn't take my voice. Closed it gently. And that's when the phone rang again. This time it was the Department of Justice. We found him, the agent said. He booked a ferry out of Maine under a false name. One of the dock workers recognized his photo. He's been apprehended. I sat down slowly, closed my eyes. It was done. The man who stole my future, who buried girls in silence, who twisted the sacred into something rotten, was finally going to face the law. The next morning I was flown to Washington, D.C., to testify before a grand jury. Daniel walked with me the entire way. Cameras flashed as I entered the courthouse. But I didn't flinch. Inside I took my seat, swore my oath, and for the next 2 hours I told them everything. About Anne-Marie, about Ruth, about the crypt, and about the day a priest told me I was unfit for God, just to keep his secrets buried. When I stepped out of the courtroom, survivors lined the hallway, some in tears, some with fists clenched in solidarity. One by one they hugged me. Called me Grandma Margaret. The voice we needed. I cried for the first time in days. Not from fear, but from peace. Weeks later I returned home. The cats were still there. My garden had overgrown, but the hydrangeas bloomed strong. Just like me. One morning I woke to find a letter in my mailbox. No name. No return address. Inside, a newspaper clipping. Priest convicted in 45-year cover-up. Life sentence without parole. And a note. For Anne-Marie. You kept your promise. I held it to my chest and whispered, rest now, my dear. They can't hurt us anymore. And for the first time in my 82 years, felt whole. If this story touched your heart, if you believe the truth must always rise, then like this video, share it with someone who needs courage, and subscribe for more stories that remind us. It's never too late to speak up. Your voice matters. Just like Margaret's.